Is it okay to beat up your wife? No, of course not. But in some American states in the 19th century, it was a legal grey area, and lawyers would sometimes reference the origin of an old English expression supposedly passed down from English common law to defend a violent husband. The origin story, of course, is completely and utterly false, yet it is still being cited today as fact. Which common expression am I talking about? I'll give you a moment to try and guess. Today on Let Me Talk TV, I'm calling out BS on fake idiom origin stories. I've got a few to share with you, and I've also got my trusted BS-ometer here, basometer. Let's call it a basometer. And I'm going to rate each origin story from 1 to 5 on the basometer based on how implausible and how ludicrous it is. 5 being the most ridiculous. And of course, I'll give you the true origin story too. And you know, this will make you laugh. There was also one idiot who posted a video on YouTube about the origin of a common British expression that so far garnered more than 100,000 views and is complete nonsense. And what's more surprising is that nobody noticed. Who was that idiot, I hear you cry? Oh dear, it was me. In my defence, I didn't know it was fake at the time, and I will return to that later. But first, let's look how a fake origin story was used to justify domestic violence. The idiom in question is rule of thumb. If you don't know the idiom, a rule of thumb is a guideline or principle that you follow to help you make decisions or estimate something based on, practical experience rather than exact calculations. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. The rule of thumb for editing a video is that it takes about 1 hour of work for every minute of footage. The rule of thumb is that you should save about 10% of your monthly income for your retirement. According to the fake origin story, in English common law, it was legal for a man to beat his wife with a stick, provided the stick was no thicker than their thumb. Now let's be clear, it's not true. It's clearly nonsense. There's never been such a law. But in the 18th century, Sir William Blackstone, a politician and English writer, who in his work, Commentaries on the Laws of England, 1759, mentions an ancient law that allows moderate beatings of the wife by the husband. Let me quote you what he said. The husband, by the old law, might give his wife moderate correction, for as he is to answer for her misbehaviour, the law thought it reasonable to entrust him with the power of restraining her by domestic chastisement in the same moderation that a man is allowed to correct his servants or children for whom the master or parent is also liable in some cases to answer. But the power of correction was confined within reasonable bounds, and the husband was prohibited from using any violence to his wife. So to sum up, you can beat up your wife, your children, or servants, but only a little bit. Oh dear. How else am I supposed to chastise my footman, my valet, my cook, and my army of other servants waiting on me hand and foot at Let Them Talk TV mansions? The world is going to the dogs. By the way, just to clarify, common law is unwritten law. It's based on legal precedent. Anyway, American law is largely based on English common law, and if you're an American lawyer, feel free to correct me in the comments. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, many American states followed the tradition of English common law, where domestic violence was often treated as a private matter and not a criminal offence. When cases of wife beating came to court, the rule of thumb was used on at least 3 occasions to justify the violence, even though this ancient law never existed and the judges rejected this defence. However, today you still hear this story repeated, even by lawyers. Domestic violence is a crime, but the law would be better served if lawyers stuck to the facts rather than repeated stories that are untrue. So where does rule of thumb really come from? Although the precise origin is unknown, we do know that for centuries the thumb has been used in many trades to make a rough estimate. That's about an inch. That's the width of a thumb. So it can be used to measure something in inches. Brewers would place their thumb in the beer vat to gauge the temperature of the liquid, roughly. And the Oxford English Dictionary cites the first recorded use of the phrase as 1658. Okay, so how much does this get on the basometer? Well, although the wife-beating story is fake, there were laws in the Middle Ages that wouldn't, resonate with a 20th century society. So I can kind of understand why people believed it. So it just gets a 2 on the basometer. Let's move on. For our next fake idiom story, we move from legal mischief making to chucking infants. It is the phrase to throw the baby out with the bathwater. To throw the baby out with the bathwater means that when you are getting rid of something bad or problematic, be careful not to throw away something of value at the same time. So, for example, I know you want to modernise the building, but if you tear down all the original historical features, you'll be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If you cancel all future school trips to the country just because one child got sick, you'll be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Now let's look at this video from List 25 with 1.8 million views. Explain the origin.
History. During the 1500s, most people bathed once a year. Even when they did bathe, the entire family used the same tub full of water. The man of the house bathed first, followed by other males, then females, and finally the babies. You can imagine how thick and cloudy the water became by that time, so the infants' mothers had to take care not to throw them out with the bathwater when they emptied the tub.
Now, there's a lot to unpack here. Firstly, you can't just weasel in a phrase like most people bathed only once a year and expect people to accept it as fact. The truth is, just like people today, medieval people didn't want to be smelly, so they washed quite often. Of course, there were no hot showers and access to any kind of hot water took time, to heat up, but they would wash their face and their hands and their feet every day, and less often, perhaps 2 or 3 times a week, they might wash from a basin with a cloth or a sponge, and if they were near a river or a stream, they could bathe there. So returning to our story, it gets even stranger. So each person in the household would take a bath, and the last one to take it was the baby, who was left there and forgotten, maybe drowned. And then the mother would carry the bathtub into the street and tip over the dirty water and the unseen baby into the street. Moreover, it must have happened with enough regularity that this egregious act of forgetfulness became noteworthy, earning its place in the canon of English idioms. So what is the true origin? It's a translation from the German.
Schüttet das Kind mit dem Bade aus.
And comes from Thomas Murner's satirical work,
Narrenbeschwörung.
published in 1512. The phrase was used by Murner about the overzealousness of religious reform, but we won't go into that today, or any day, to be honest. So let's look at the basometer. This one's ludicrous, it's ridiculous. The basometer is off the scale. How could anyone believe this? and so it gets a 5 out of 5. The next idiom is on the wagon, which you use when you stop drinking alcohol because of previous overindulgence, shall we say. So, for example, can I get you a beer, Bob? No. I've been overdoing it in the last few weeks. I'm on the wagon. I'll just have a mineral water, please. Okay. I'll let Jules from Jules Guides continue the story.
And the reason we say that is because, well, here at St Giles in the Fields Church is where the condemned prisoners who were on their way to be hanged at Tyburn Gallows, back in the old days when they used to do the hangings up in Marble Arch, they would stop here and the good people from the church would offer one last drink to the condemned man here at the pub next door, which in those days was called the Resurrection Gate. So they'd go for a drink, then they'd have to get back onto the wagon, and their feet wouldn't touch the ground again until they reached the gallows and were dead, actually. So this would be the last time their feet would touch the ground. They'd generally be bought one drink, and if anyone said, hey, do you want another drink? They'd say, oh no, sorry, he's on the wagon.
Now I must say, first of all, that I'm a big fan of Jules' guides and his excellent videos about London, and anyway, it would be hypocritical for me to criticise, as I'll make that clear shortly, but he got this one wrong. A cursory glance at the timeline exposes the flaws in this story. On the Wagon is first recorded in 1904, and the last hanging at Tyburn was in 1783. So what is the true origin? It's American in origin, and the expression was originally on the water wagon, and it comes from those temperance people, those who abstained from alcohol. So they got their drink from the water wagon instead. Yeah, it's as simple as that. So let's look at the basometer. The story is far-fetched, but you can imagine friends and well-wishers offering the condemned highwayman or sheep rustler or purse snatcher a last drink before he gets carted off, literally, to the gallows. That's a kind of a heartwarming story, isn't it? Even though it's not true. So for that reason, I can only give it a 3 out of 5 on the basometer. Now let me tell you that for many years while I was teaching English, I would end the lesson with an idiom and its history. And my main source was this book. Unfortunately, now that I've done more research, it's obviously that many of the idiom histories are not only wrong in this book, but utter nonsense. Just glancing through, it says, for example, that the word shit is an acronym, SHIT. It's an acronym for Store High in Transit. When farmers transported manure, it was smelly, so they had to put it on a higher shelf. Really? Really? It's hardly worthy of response, but just to give you the facts, it comes from Old English. And in German and Dutch, they have similar words, don't they? Clearly a 5 on the basometer. And yeah, unfortunately, this book is replete with errors, and I'm just going to respond to a couple, one of which turns up a lot in word histories, and that is dead ringer. And a dead ringer is somebody who looks like somebody else, and you might be the dead ringer of a famous person. Let us know in the comments. And the origin story from the book goes like this. In medieval times, when medicine wasn't as advanced as it is now, sometimes a person was pronounced dead when they were not. And in order to prevent this, they buried people with a string attached to a bell, which could be rung by the unlucky fellow if they regained consciousness. So let me quote you from the book here. Many bodies were exhumed after the bells were rung, and some people carried on their normal lives, but when spotted in the street, startled acquaintances would cry, "That looks like Jack Jones. I thought he was dead," to which they would receive the reply, "Yes, he must be a dead ringer. And the entry ends by saying, and I quote, and that, believe it or not, is true. Except it isn't. It's not remotely true. In fact, it's bollocks. The expression dead ringer has only been used since the 1890s, not medieval times, and it comes from horse racing, when one fast horse is entered into a race under the name of a slow horse, or vice versa, in order to manipulate betting odds. I guess horses look the same to most people. A ringer is still used that way outside of horse racing. And what about dead? Well, it just means completely, which you see in lots of other phrases. This is dead centre, you're dead right, which means you're completely right. So let's get out the basometer. Come on, there's zero evidence that anyone was ever buried with a bell above the grave, even once, let alone that it happened frequently. Medicine in the Middle Ages was primitive by modern standards, but they weren't completely ignorant. They had a way of checking if someone was actually dead, like perhaps listen for a heartbeat or a pulse, or checking the body temperature. They had some basic medical knowledge, and it implies that people being pulled out of the grave happened often enough to become a thing. And yeah, I have to give this one a 5 on the basometer. It's ludicrous, it's nonsense. 5 out of 5. And now it's confession time. I have to call BS on one of my own much loved videos, which has so far got more than 100,000 views. Now, on every video I make, there are those who scrutinise it in forensic detail, pointing out even the tiniest error in the comments section with righteous indignation. And most of the time, not always, but most of the time, they're wrong. Anyway, the irony is that this video is complete BS, but nobody noticed, except for one comment about a year ago. And the video is about the origin of that most British of all British idioms, Bob's your uncle, which means it's like that, or there you are, or et voila, if you want to use a French term. For example, the washing machine is easy to use. You put in the clothes and the powder and you press the button and Bob's your uncle. But what's the history? I'll let a much younger Gideon take up the story.
Great Britain, 1887. The Prime Minister is Robert Bob Cecil. There is a vacancy in his government for a Chief Secretary of Ireland. After much consideration, the Prime Minister makes an announcement. The new Chief Secretary of Ireland is Alfred Balfour. What? Who? People exclaimed. This is a very important post, and he's given the job to a nobody. Wait a minute. Isn't Alfred Balfour the Prime Minister's nephew? Ah, now I understand. You're a nobody, and Bob's your uncle, and you've got the job. So that's the origin of Bob's your uncle.
So the source of that video at that time was this book, mostly, and also some other sources on the internet that said more or less the same thing. However, I'm much older and wiser now, and I've done a lot more research. And no, it's not true. The story was just made up by someone somewhere. I don't know, perhaps some wasted history student in a pub after a long drinking session. Anyway, there is no reference to it during the Victorian era when it was supposed to have taken place. The true story behind Bob's your uncle is even more surprising than the fake one, and The idiom doesn't start to get used until the 1950s, and believe it or not, it's American in origin. I can't tell you more right now, but fear not, I'm going to spill the beans in an upcoming video, so do check that out. The Robert Cecil story is kind of believable. Nepotism was and still is widespread. Politicians do favour their relatives. Dictators often pass power to their offspring. However, in this case, I'm afraid Robert Cecil's nepotism and the origin of the idiom don't match up on the timeline. It appeared 60 years too late. And except for that, it could be true. For that reason, I can only give it a 1 out of 5 on the basometer. Do you know of any fake idiom origin stories? Let us know in the comments. And if you're interested in the history of the English language, then do sign up to The Rambler, my newsletter, or become a Patreon, wisdom guaranteed. That's all for now. Have a beautiful day. Bye.